Hello, everyone. We're just going to give everybody a minute to get in the room. So bear with us. We'll get started momentarily. All right. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you're joining us tonight for 8 predictions that we think are going to shape the 2026 college admissions cycle and some of the upcoming cycles. Poll is up. Just it helps us to know who's in the room so that we can tailor our discussion a little bit based on who you are. You don't need to tell us anything about yourself other than your role in the process. But if you could take a second and do that, that would be great. So welcome. My name is Natalie Gallagher. I'm the president of Guidewell Education. We are going to be we're going to go through 8 predictions tonight. Our goal with those is not to overwhelm you, but to hopefully give you some good information. Make sure that you're on the cutting edge because admissions is changing rapidly and all the time. And then, send you on your way. But we've got this incredible panel of experts who I'm going to introduce momentarily. We're going to take about 45 minutes to walk through the trends so that you know what's going on, but we're going to leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please use the Q&A function, submit your questions. We're going to hold them till the end, but you submit them anytime that you have them. Don't feel like you need to wait. And if you miss something, don't worry. Do not feel like you need to rapidly take notes or, sometimes when we do these things in person, people pull out their phones and start recording. It doesn't need to happen. We are in fact recording this and we'll be glad to send you the recording. So if you miss something, don't worry about it. So I'm privileged to introduce our panelists tonight. They are incredible educators, test prep folks, college admissions counselors with a wealth of experience who collectively have been doing this work for decades. So we've got Drew Halpern from Summit Education Group, Dr. Jed Applerouth from Applerouth Education, Josh Davis from ESM Prep UK, which is soon to be called Guidewell Global because of their incredible partnership with UES, and Lisa Bain Carlton from ESM Prep College MatchPoint. So just really excited and welcome. Thank you, panelists, for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see your lovely faces. We're going to go ahead and get started with our very first trend. So the first trend that we're seeing in the admissions process is that the flagship schools are starting to rival the Ivies. So some of the top public universities in the country are now as competitive for out-of-state students as the schools that we all think of as the hyper-competitive ones. So families still tend to think of these flagship public options like UCLA, Michigan, Georgia Tech, UT Austin, UVA as safer options. What's changed in the last few years that means that might not necessarily be a good way to think about them? Josh?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. So, over the last decade plus, you could see that typically students who would aim for, we call them like tier 1, right? The Ivies, but also you throw in the Chicagos and the Stanfords and MITs, just really, really, really selective universities. It just made sense to apply what we call early action, a non-binding application to public schools because there was no restriction from that. Any private school would let you do that. But lately, those public schools are seeing just an explosion in their application volumes. And obviously, we like to use data to back up our points. So like before 2020, UCLA, was kind of like knocking on the door of 100,000 applications, trying to be the first university to get to 100,000. And now they're at 150,000, right? That's a lot of applications. I think historically they had like 35 application admissions officers. Obviously, they have a lot of readers, but the point is they have so many to choose from. And we saw their, acceptance rate kind of go below 10% now. And of course, when we say below 10%, those are typically the numbers that we associate with those tier 1 Ivies and so on. So it's just data driven. The stats show that you can't say UCLA is my backup. Michigan now also surpassing 100,000 applications this year, probably for the first time, also has, an acceptance rate in the teens. It's more selective than ever. It's obviously, there's this huge change now where University of Michigan is offering early decision, right? Who would have thought that would happen, again, 10, 15 years ago? UVA is a school that already went to early decision, and they've seen their application skyrocket, but also their yield kind of go up. So they really are functioning now like the private schools, and they can take the pick of the litter. And obviously, it's not for everyone, and we understand that, but it is for the, very academic. That's one thing that goes without saying.
And Josh, just quickly for the students and the parents who maybe aren't as familiar with some of the lingo of the trade, when you say yield, what does that mean?
Yeah, so every school, it's like when you throw a party, you don't want to invite like 1,000 people and like 10 people show up, right? So with universities, we don't want to accept too many people. They want to get a good sense of, if we admit you, are you going to come? So a lot of schools want to see a yield around 70, 80%, obviously for like the most selective ones. But every school wants that number to go up because that yield kind of affects, your place in the rankings. And although we don't particularly care about rankings that much, a lot of people do initially when you first start looking at colleges. So it's a very important number for sure, alongside the acceptance rate, which makes it very selective. And of course, the application volume, which makes you like, this is how attractive we are.
And I'll throw in something in terms of like what's driving a lot of this is just economics. That like I live in Atlanta, and the Hope Scholarship, it was Zell Miller back in '94, has changed the nature of these schools so dramatically. Where Georgia was everyone's backup now at the school, and the weakest students in the class went to Georgia, and now it's the brightest students in the class. And it's just economics, because kids with these really high grades and high test scores, go almost for free to Georgia. And then versus spending, 90 grand a year free, it's very compelling. So we're keeping some great students there, driving, and the Florida, the Bright Futures, Alabama, they have their scholarships. Now Alabama is driving in almost 2/3 of the kids from out of state to Alabama. It's amazing what's happening. But it's the money that's keeping the really sharp kids locally and making out of state just so tight and so competitive. And also economically, spending, if you're saving 20, 30, 40 grand from out of state, that's still very meaningful over the course of 4 years. So it's having a huge impact on the selectivity of the UNC and Texas and Michigan, all these great schools.
Thanks, Jed. So Lisa, Josh, I know you guys advise students, you help them put their list together. When you're working with a student who is applying out of state, like Jed said, right? Like if all these great students are staying in state, it really squeezes the spaces available for out of state students. How do you advise students on whether to consider a particular state school in a different state as like a reach school, a target school? How do they think about that or think about where they might fit in that?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. First of all, I think you need to think about your major, because the other thing we're seeing is highly selective majors. So if you take some of these schools and you look at business, engineering, pre-med, those are even more selective in these flagships. So I think one is, what major are you going for, right? And how strong of a fit are you for that? And then, students need to be careful looking at the overall admit rate, because I think it's so enticing, right? And then they're so disappointed because the out of state rate or the rate for a certain major is much lower. So let's say, like, I'm in Texas, so UT Austin. If you take out, we have the 5% rule where kids who are in the top 5% get in. If you take those kids out, the acceptance rate is just about 10%. But if you go to computer science, it's about 3%, maybe 2. So there's so many variables that go into this. And of course, families don't have a way of understanding that. They're just looking in a FIS guide or something and seeing that it says, oh, it's a 23%. And they're like, oh, my kid can probably do that. I also think it's a shift in thinking, because we've seen schools like Tennessee, I'll use it as an example. They went from taking 60% of students out of state to now they're at, like, I think it's 28. You know what I'm saying? So some of them are huge jumps. And so one of the things is also just to have a broad list, because you don't know which year that's going to be when they win the national football, like that's going to have a big impact. So, Miami is probably on its way for sure,
Josh is in Miami, folks.
Yeah, please don't jinx, but yeah.
That's actually a really nice segue. You guys have set me up well, because Jed, you mentioned Georgia and Alabama. Lisa, you mentioned Texas and Tennessee. The second trend that we're seeing is actually about the South, right? These Southern schools are starting to earn national attention. It used to be that they were more regional and they attracted a more regional set of students, but we're really starting to see top students from across the country attracted to these southern campuses. So Lisa, what is that about? What's driving that surge? Which students also tend to get there and thrive versus the ones that maybe get there and discover like, whoa, I'm not a grits person.
Right. Well, it's all about the South right now, and it's really interesting because if you look at students in the Northeast, there's just an enormous surge. The University of South Carolina has the most, students from the Northeast. They have like 1,800. We've seen like Ole Miss had a 361% increase of kids from the Northeast. I mean, it's just crazy. LSU had 470% increase. So we're just seeing these huge shifts. And I think Jed, actually, I really appreciate that, Jed. You kind of threw me a softball in the previous answer. One of the reasons is because of cost. So these schools tend to be very generous with merit money. And I think that impacts. They've also been very strategic, both in putting reps in different locations to start promoting their school. They've also been strategic in most of them have invested a lot of money in their engineering programs, their computer science so those very popular majors, they've really spent the money on, which I think has really had an impact. I also think good old Instagram and TikTok are influencing this because they kind of represent what kids think of as sort of the all-American college. So when students are getting so much of their information about college, I think those schools kind of look like what they expect, you know what I'm saying, what they expect college to be. I think those are a few of the things. If we look at California, if we go to the other coast, we see a little bit of a different trend where families are looking to, because of the UC and all the capacity issues with UCs, but they tend to be more interested in Texas, like SMU and TCU are the biggest increases for students in California. So it's an interesting, both coasts are kind of coming, and the Midwest is also seeing a big surge. So it's really, it's everywhere that the South. And I think students who are going to thrive in these environments are oftentimes students who can handle bigger institutions, right? Like who can, I always say, can you elbow a little bit? Are you okay to be, because if you can't, you might do better in a little bit smaller place. And then those students who do want that really big football, Greek life, all of that. And I think students who are going for pre-professional majors oftentimes like these schools as well. I mean, we could go on and on, but I think those are some of the types of students that thrive in these environments. And I think the student who doesn't love the big rah-rah, maybe that's not the best fit for them. But I think that parents, when they visit these campuses, what I hear is they're surprised by what they think the students are smarter than they thought they would be, those kind of things. So I think that, that's become a really significant shift that doesn't look like it's letting up either. I think it's going to keep going. Yeah.
There's also a piece with, we talked about football and the rah-rah, and whenever you win a big bowl game, applications spike like crazy. I'm waiting next year for IU. Their numbers are going to go because the perception is you see all this fun, all this play. I want to be there, be part of that. And also the sense that there's so much uncertainty out there. There's so much like, let me have my kids have a good 4 years, have a fun 4 years. And so the idea of, they're working really hard. Who knows what's coming with all this AI stuff in the world? And so the perception is these are going to be places where my kid's going to really have a great positive 4 years of life. And so, and every time anything, Auburn wins, pop, Florida wins, Georgia wins, Bama, TCU, they're constantly picking up all these applications when, this perception of, your school's winning, having fun. I want to go there. It's quite natural.
And I'll also add to it too, because I'm here in the Northeast. I'm just outside of Boston. So many of the students we work with, they're suddenly putting these types of schools on their list. And I will say that the students that have trailblazed is the wrong word, but for students who have kind of, done it, like they are reporting back that they're having a great time. It's everything they thought it was going to be. They're super excited that they added one of the larger, state institutions to their list and enrolled there. So I think that's also kind of feeding into it a little bit, that the students that are going and, maybe getting outside of kind of the provincial, like Northeast small liberal arts college bubble a little bit, are reporting back that they're having a great experience with it. So I think that's giving sort of underclassmen a little bit more, or the younger students a little bit more, courage, or in terms of continuing that trend and applying.
Makes sense. Well, we keep talking about this for a while. I find it really interesting, but I got to move us on to our third prediction, which is actually a little bit of a pivot. And Drew, I'm going to come back to you about it because, around test scores, because so in 2020, we all know, like, the story around testing was, oh, tests aren't important anymore, right? Tests are dead. They're all optional. Nobody's taking them. And now test optional has been here for a few years. We're starting to see the pendulum swing back. More and more schools are announcing that they're going back test required. But even for the tests the schools that have remained optional, we're seeing, and I think the prediction is that we're going to continue to see that for some schools, optional doesn't necessarily mean neutral, right?
Right.
So can you break that down a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I think there's an important
optional.
Right. I think there's an important distinction to make here. That test optional does not mean test blind. So what test optional means is, at the end of the day, your students are in control of their standardized testing scores. So they decide whether they want to submit those scores as part of that application or not. So if they decide that ultimately they feel like those scores are going to be supportive of their application and submit them, those schools are absolutely going to see those scores and consider those scores in that application read. So the trends that we've been seeing is, we've definitely been seeing, as you mentioned, an uptick in terms of the percent of students taking tests, and also the percent of students applying, especially to some of these more or most selective test optional schools, with standardized testing scores. Having said that, and Lisa and Josh can back me up on this, students absolutely are still getting into colleges without submitting standardized testing scores. But if you're looking at some of those more selective or most selective test optional schools, we are definitely seeing the trend of more and more students who enroll there and been accepted have submitted standardized testing scores. And I'll just give you an example. So for instance, like Duke University, they are still test optional, but if you look at the data that they report, roughly 85% of their incoming class actually submitted testing scores. So that just, with that kind of data, we just get a sense that, yes, Duke University, it is still test optional. There are students who got into Duke University without submitting standardized testing scores, but based on that percentage that they're reporting, we would say Duke University, even though they are test optional, they do seem to be leaning into testing scores. And then we look at another institution like Northeastern, another selective institution, has got less than 10% admit rate now. They are still test optional and are going to continue to be test optional. But if you look at their percentage of incoming students, roughly 60% actually got in test optionally. 40% submitted scores. So there's an institution where you think, okay, maybe, they're maybe leaning into test scores a little bit less, but there is a continuum. Like, there are certainly test optional schools out there who, really, it does not kind of impact their decision whether you submit scores or not. Whereas if you're looking at some of those more or most selective test optional schools, it does seem like, even though they are test optional, they do appear to be leaning into standardized testing scores. So that's kind of what we're seeing. And we do anticipate that trend is going to kind of continue. Having said that, like those most selective tier 1 schools, like the Ivies, like almost all the Ivies have gone back to test required. Some of the larger state schools particularly in the South, they've all gone back to test required. So, and we might, looking out a little bit, we might add a couple more schools like Duke University. They might actually ultimately go back to just being like, look, we are leaning into testing. Let's just go back to requiring testing. But it kind of gives you a sense, hopefully, of kind of the, just sort of the different divisions there as you're thinking about test optional and test optional schools.
Then Josh, Lisa, I know you guys work with a lot of students and help them like figure out, hey, what do I need to be a compelling applicant at this particular school? It sounds like, if I'm picking up what Drew's saying correctly, it's not quite as simple as going to the school's website and being like, right, there's test optional. Like, you also have to know what does test optional mean for this particular school? And is it is it really optional? Is it like,
And
does
also
it
what it
significantly
means,
impact my odds? Yeah.
and also what it means to that individual student, because it is
Right.
very much kind of a case by case basis.
Right.
There's no kind of like general rule. There's some general
Yeah.
guidelines and things, but Josh and Lisa, go ahead. I don't
Yeah,
want
I mean,
to
I just
interrupt
wanna
you.
make it-
how do you guys think about whether it's going to meaningfully help a student
For
or
sure.
not,
I mean,
right?
for me, also just knowing that a lot of schools that were test optional pre-COVID, like the Northeasterns, the Wake Forest, the NYUs, they have a method in place for evaluating students without test scores. A lot of colleges, when they had to go test optional or test blind, they realized like, wait, how do we like separate these kids? Like everyone has inflated good grades, everyone has really good profiles, the essays are strong. So they just realized that like they value test scores, fair or unfair. So that's why I always tell kids, you just want to be able to use it to your advantage. And of course, there are students who at the end of the day just don't have a score that they can submit. And we get that. And if it gets to that, that's okay. But you can't go into the process just assuming I'm not going to have a variable that could really influence a decision. And funny enough, when you say these schools that are kind of staying test optional, I'm looking at it from like a recruiting standpoint. I had a student athlete where, we're talking to a school and I'm like, you need to take a test. And he says, oh, like the coach said I'm test optional. And like, it's a tool that they can use for kids. Oh, now this kid loves that school because he doesn't have to test there, but it's not the same for every single student. Right. And you always have to remember that.
Yeah, and I think
So I'm going to push. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say just a couple things. One is I think since COVID till now, I really advise every student to take a test because we don't know what school they might decide they want to do at the last minute and we need a test and we don't have one. So to me, that is really critical. It also can be really critical for merit aid. So I think that is another thing to think about. Or for a student who's had a rocky transcript, I think if they had a 1 semester blip because of health or whatever, a good test score combined with their grades going back up is going to tell a way better story.
That makes sense. I like your point about they don't necessarily know what their list is ultimately going to be. This is like really back. If I knew what year, it would age me. But way before the test optional stuff. But I had a student who took the ACT and it was when writing was optional, right? There were a lot of schools that didn't require writing. And so she took the ACT an additional time. It was like her third time. Got a phenomenal score, like significant jump, bigger jump than she ever thought she was capable of. And it changed the list of schools that she wanted to apply to, which was a senior, and she didn't take writing. And the school that was like number 1 on her list required the writing, and it was a heartbreak. So I really like that point because that like all these years later still sticks with me. That's like, oh my gosh, like that kid could have been a competitive candidate at that school and she just wasn't able to apply. So makes sense. Okay. Trend 4 or prediction 4 is all about the timing of admissions because we are seeing this sucker roll back earlier and earlier and earlier, and more schools are accepting a large share of their class through an early process, whether that's early action, early decision, single choice, early action, you name your flavor. Josh, Lisa, like early decision, early action now seem to shape much of the incoming class. So what does it mean for families who wait?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of waiting too much. Ideally, and when we say early decision, for the audience, that's a binding agreement, right? That the student, the parents, and the school sign that said if the student's accepted, they're going to that university. Usually the deadline is November 1st. They hear back December 15th. And if they get in, they're done with the process. And it should be like a very like momentous occasion. Like that's the whole point of the game. And I think what we've been able to do is make our kids understand that there's such a value in being able to identify an ED school because the numbers, again, data, 50% of incoming classes are usually filled by early decision. And of course, early decision, since you can only do one, it's a smaller applicant pool compared to regular decision. You might see like 5x, 6x number of applicants, and yet you're still fighting for a small number of spots, right? So even if you're reaching for a very, very high reach, ED can help you. But more importantly, if you have a strong profile and you realize, I love Tulane, for example, and you ED to Tulane, like you have a very good chance of getting into Tulane, as opposed to if you do regular decision, you're just not getting into Tulane. This is that simple. They are a school that really, really values early decision. And there's a number of schools now that have, introduced ED0, which is like, we actually want to get you to commit basically before you go back for your senior year, right? So the idea of being able to secure, a student, a future client and family, it goes back to that yield. Again, it's just one way to increase that, which means students now need to be able to identify that school, before senior year.
Yeah, and I would say to loop back to the Southern thing, we're seeing with some of these Southern schools in the early action being that non-binding early application pool. And we're seeing like Auburn, for example, has got a 9/15. That's their first deadline. I mean, that's early, early, early. So Texas A&M, you need to have that application in August, especially if you want to be in a business school. So, I mean, both early action, you're seeing the need to go earlier, and then of course with early decision as well. And of course, I think colleges really want to secure those applicants, right? It's an economic decision that I don't think sadly is going to, is going to shift. So I think all of this
goes back to Josh's yield thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think then what happens with students as we're counseling them, everything has to move backwards, right? Like students have to have an idea of, kind of what their academic interests are. If they're, with their major, they've got to have some story with that shows evidence of that. They've got to have the testing done, right? So all of these things then move their college list, sort of like the example you used, like all of those things so that we don't want to show up and decide that we want Auburn on, October 15th, like that would be unfortunate. And showing interest to the colleges, all those things get moved back because of this as we go earlier. And I agree with Josh. I think we will see more of this zero, this early decision zero as well. So this is another one that I think is just going to keep on keeping on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say one more thing. It's also important, okay, not every school that might have ED0, but a lot of schools have ED2 now, which is, again, another new wrinkle that admissions decided to throw in, this century over, okay, you didn't get into your ED1 top choice in November 1st, that you applied to November 1st, but now before January 1st, you can take a second stab at a binding decision. And we've seen that, again, more and more schools rolling that out, comes back to the yield, but also kids being able to identify, okay, that's my top choice. If I don't get there, I have a few early action, and then can I get an ED2? And it's a particular type of school usually that offers ED2. So once again, it's not for everyone, but it's important to at least consider them.
You mentioned that the deadline for most schools for ED1 is November 1st, for ED2, January 1st. What are we seeing for ED0? How early is this process rolling back?
I mean, the Common App opens August 1st. So I'm not saying, hey, August 2nd, you need to have already been submitted, but again, it's so new that the data from one year to the next is like even the rules around it are changing. Last year it was only open to a certain amount of students. Now it's open to like all these other students. So, we're definitely keeping an eye on it. But, I had a student get in, September 18th into U Chicago, and it's like, that's a very, very happy family. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. Well, moving us along. So trend 7 or prediction 7 or 5. I'm skipping ahead. 5. I think some of us, particularly parents, if it's been a while since we've gone through this process, you think, oh, my kids should join all the clubs and do all the sports and do the drama, and they need to be well-rounded and they need to show that they're interested in all kinds of things. But really the picture that we're seeing, and colleges are really thinking more about a well-rounded class as opposed to well-rounded individuals, and they're seeming to prefer depth over breadth when it comes to activities. It seems like commitment maybe matters more than volume. So for those of you who are advising students through the college admissions process, why does this sustained engagement seem to matter more than like a long activity list in the college admissions process, and kind of how has that shifted over the years as you've been advising students?
Well, I've been doing this a long time, so it's definitely shifted for sure. I think it's that we have a lot of inflated grades and things, and then we have test scores, and colleges are looking for some way to figure out what's this student about? What are they intellectually curious about? Where do they spend their time when they're not in the classroom? And that could be really, really broad. But it definitely, I think this is a little bit developmental. I do think in those early grades, like ninth grade, you still have to do exploration, right? So that might look broad, but it narrows in like a funnel, okay? And so by the time a student is, in like I try to have it like end of sophomore year, they're going to do something in the summer around something that they're genuinely interested in an intellectual way, right? And so by that point, what we're looking for is initiative, things where they're taking initiative, things where they're making an impact, and things that are related to hopefully the major, if they're especially if they're interested in a lot of these flagship schools where they put a high value on what we call fit to major. Students need activities that back up the classes they took. So our whole story comes together. In other words, the academic story meshes the activity story and that line. So, I was just talking with a family and I was saying, no, 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 we don't need a whole new thing for, between some junior year and senior year. I'm always wanting to pull a thread through. I'd rather pull something that we're already working in and let the student take on more leadership or more interest or more research or whatever what their thing is. And I would say most students, because I don't want you people to walk away thinking, oh, students only do one thing, right? Most students still are going to have multiple threads, but deeper is better than wide, right? I think what hurts students is when a college is reading their application and they can't make sense of the story, right? It's just a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. It's not that that's necessarily a bad thing to do, but from the college's goal of trying to learn what this student's curious about, what they're interested in, what they value, I think that that is really important. The other thing we see playing out here is character. I think another thing that colleges are really looking at is how students work with other students. And so any ways that we can let those things come through are super helpful. And I think there's one of the great American myths in college admissions is that, like service work should all be about getting the most hours. And I think that is really not true, that can you show that you genuinely care about some issue? So there's a lot of different ways to go at activities. Not every student's going to be singularly focused on one major, but the student that does pick some things and go deep into it is going to be better served than the student that is sort of a scatter plot, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'll just have two quick examples. I don't know how
Sure.
quick they'll be, but one is, like Lisa was saying, a student who's like more aligned with academics and he wanted to study, international relations and politics. And in ninth grade, it's like, okay, I'll just join MUN and debate. And that's like how you start and you learn a little bit. And then he realized, okay, this is not really like, feeding me enough. So it was like, can I get involved with local politics? And, found someone he could canvas for and kind of campaign and learn that side of it. Then when he was doing that, realized, man, like there's I have all these questions. And then the research came out of that. And he was able to like get some research and publish, honestly, and, find a professor who's able to publish it with. And again, like you said, it was that thread that connected it all. And now when he tells me I want to study government, I believe him because he actually has real world experience to back it up. Now, on the flip side, I had a kid who was like a math and physics wizard, and he was really, really into music. And he's like, hey, like, I know they don't go together, but I just really want to learn how to DJ. So he taught himself how to DJ. And then he realized, man, like, I think like a lot of kids would want to learn this. And he started like a little EDM club at school. And then he started teaching other kids how to DJ. And then the school appreciated it and said, can you collaborate with the public school across the street? And for the first time, they like merged clubs between like this little private school and the public school. And then they threw like a rave in the school gym. It was like the perfect kind of, you can have a charity event, but like he really cared about the charity event. He cared about people showing up. He cared about getting the word out. He cared about where the money went, right? And again, it just made the story much more believable. So we don't, it's not about trying to, like you said, plug in the activity list and stack it up. It's about really figuring out what do you want to do. And then when you reflect on it, what does it say about you?
And I think that's such an important piece is, can you reflect about what you actually did is so important. I always say to parents, talk with your kids at dinner using reflection. I think that's one of the things that's so hard for these kids. And these things happen organically. I love the story you gave, Josh, because I think sometimes when you hear this, then parents think, okay, I got to Google Maps this. I'm going to map this out like this. In all my time, I've never quite seen that work. You just kind of have to go with the kid and let them go here. And then if that doesn't work, it gives us information. And so we go here. So, it is the more organic. So there is some trust involved in it because we can't quite know. There's no way you would have ever known what that kid was going to do with that, right? Like, too cool. Yeah.
I love that. I'm gonna have us make a hard pivot, actually, though. And Jed, I'm gonna pull you in because you've been pretty quiet tonight. So you guys mentioned earlier, and I think you mentioned just the sheer volume of applications that these schools are getting at this point, right? Like schools well over 100,000 applicants. Tiny schools that are getting way more than their 3 people admission staff can possibly handle. And so increasingly, even as we talk to students about how they shouldn't use AI to help with their applications, increasingly schools are using AI to help read those applications. And I think many families don't realize that. And so what is knowing that the first cut is likely to be made by an AI computer, like bot? What does that change for students and in terms of thinking about things?
I mean, it's already happened. We're already there. And we were talking amongst ourselves with Natalie and you and Bob, Diana, at VA Tech. They've already done this for this current round, where they used to have 2 readers for the essay. Now there's 1 digital reader, 1 machine, and a human. And the inter-rater reliability is extremely high because machines are amazing at this. And they've been doing this. And part of the logic also is I have to hire 200 part-time, full-time readers. I burn them out. They churn out quickly. And honestly, like a human, it takes 2 minutes per essay. The machine can read 200,000 in an hour. And that's your whole year. Like in an hour, you're done. So they're scored and graded. And they'll be highly tied to a human rating. And they've been doing this already for the GMAT and the GRE for 18 years. And the inter-rater reliability is extremely high because this is algorithmically evaluating, the grammar, the quality of the writing, the air, machines are good at this. And at some point, your APs will be graded by machines. And they're doing this at the state level, school level. And so part of it is simply accepting that and embracing it. I don't think you change how you write. I've coached kids on the section for the GRE and GMAT. I didn't tell them to write for the bot, but just write really well. And the bot's algorithm can parse out the quality of the high level of your writing. And still, what Rick Clark said at Tech is essentially what I need is I need the machines to help me winnow down all these applications, tens of thousands, down to the 8,000 I should read closely. And so eventually in committee, we're doing a deep dive. But the first pass, UNC is doing this right now. They're using the Slate's AI reader. And Slate, 500 plus, so many colleges use Slate. And they're making the AI tools embedded. So they don't have to invent the wheel. They simply, buy a monthly, annual subscription, and boom, it's right there. And what UNC is using it for, again, their application Crush, is to score parts of the essay and also to evaluate the academic rigor of parts of the transcript. And boom, you're a 7, you're an 8. It feeds it in. Rick Clark at Tech, he said what they're doing for transfers are applying. Boom, it's auto pulling, scraping, populating all of their transcript academic work into the tech format. Saves all this time and energy and effort. And there's a weird thing happening over at Caltech where kids who submit research, they are asked to interview with a virtual video bot. And the bot asks them questions, queries them, and then it'll create a little transcript, summary, synopsis, which goes to the committee. And so the quality of their answers, the depth of their understanding of the project, because you can't possibly, fewer and fewer schools are doing interviews because the application numbers are nuts. But if a machine did it with accuracy and that could create, more of a human voice mediated by a machine back to the admissions committee. So we're going to see a lot more of this everywhere. Miami is piloting something for the past couple of years. And I just see this for the efficiency's sake and especially schools are very selective. And again, at the very end, you'll get a deep, thorough read, a personal, intimate read. But the first cut very likely is going to be mediated by these AIs. That's coming. It's already here, and there's going to be a lot more of it coming.
Well, I don't have to like it. I know you tell me
Don't
it's
have to like
better,
it. I know
but
it
I don't
feels
have to
icky.
like it.
I will say
It
though, I
does
mean,
feel icky.
to piggyback on Jed's point though, like at the end of the day, like there is still very much human interaction in terms of this whole process, right? They're trying to make things more efficient. They're trying to be able to, in some ways, handle that crush of applications in a more fair way to be able to give, those reads a little bit more time. So really it is trying to create some efficiency, but to really sort of maximize the time that the admission officers have to be able to put that human element into this whole process.
All right, you two.
Embrace it, Natalie. Embrace it.
I'll work on embracing it. All right. Well, Drew, I'm coming back to you then.
Yeah.
You're speaking up. One of the other predictions, so prediction 7, is that we're starting to see values and social climate and the perception of sort of campus environment matter a lot more to students. And students are ruling out schools based on perceived fit,
right.
And cultural fit. So how is that like reshaping college lists and what you're hearing about students and how they think about this process?
And the way I kind of think about this is that I think what it's doing is it's just framing the process a little bit more in depth for families as a whole. So families have always done this, right? We've always come together when you're making, coming up with lists and making a decision around college. It's like, okay, we got to talk about location. We got to talk about size, right? We definitely have to talk about cost. Right? At the end of the day, how are we going to pay for this if you actually get in? And having those conversations earlier rather than on the later side just makes it a little bit easier on that tail end when you're actually, depositing and submitting. And I think that just, as you said, this idea of fit, we've always kind of had it, but this idea of kind of cultural fit, like what is my life on a daily basis on that campus actually going to look like? I think that's a great conversation for students and families to be having from the get-go. Not just, yay, it's a rah-rah school, or it has a football team and I'm excited because I went to a small school which didn't have a football team, right? But really digging in terms of the culture of it. And then the other thing I would say about this is where research is key, and also drowning out the noise a little bit, right? It's going to be your experience on that campus, right? It's not, well, I had a neighbor's friend's cousin who said this, so I'm going to take that off my list, right? You have to do the work and really dive in terms of trying to get a feel for that culture as you're doing the research on your schools. But I do feel like it's a good conversation for families to be having. If there is some central kind of value or tenet, that is important to you as a family, you want to bring that up early in this process, as you're creating schools and you're coming up with that list.
And I might add one thing to that, which is when you're visiting schools, whatever it is that's important to your family, make sure that you visit those places on campus. So if there's a particular religious group or cultural group or whatever, connecting with those on a campus when you visit really helps you get a sense versus the noise, as Drew said, because sometimes kids are like, oh, this is great, right? And maybe they didn't think it was going to be. So I'm a big fan that, I know we live in a virtual world, but stepping on actual campuses and getting some information when you're narrowing it down is really important with these values decisions, I think.
Great advice. Well, I want to make sure that we have at least 10 minutes to get to the questions because I see that there have been lots submitted, so I'm excited to address some of them. But Josh, I know you work with our UK Guidewell Global team, and so want to kind of bring the last prediction or the last trend over to you, because we're seeing more and more US students look outside of the United States for college, and so what students should consider some of their international options? What types of students have you seen that make sense for?
Yeah, for sure. And just for context, so, I grew up as an American expat living in Europe as a kid. My parents lived in Europe, and all we cared about was like getting back to America for college. And the idea that like there's now American kids who are like considering Europe and, other places around the world, it's just showing like the effects of globalization and whatnot, but also that like you said, certain kids, especially if I know exactly that I want to be a doctor, right? Or I want to be an engineer and I just want to study engineering, or I just want to study pre-med. I don't want to have, other requirements or prerequisites, or, taking humanities classes if I have no desire to write an essay. And in Europe, honestly, there's just a lot of schools that offer just that, whether it's in the UK. And of course, people know about like Oxford and Cambridge, which are kind of historically the Harvard and Yale of the UK. But there's also schools like LSE in London, Imperial for STEM. St. Andrews now is apparently 40%, if not more, American students. So our trend prediction is that more kids, beyond St. Andrews. I don't know why St. Andrews became that famous, besides the fact that obviously like royalty goes there. But aside from that, there's just like other schools that are very, very interesting. And I've had kids go to Bocconi in Milan, IE in Madrid, Sciences Po, outside of Paris. And it's not necessarily like students that you would assume. It's just a regular kid who goes to like a regular public school in Massachusetts, who, while we're doing this research, we talked about it, and he's like, I think that might be for me. And it's kids who already were thinking about, maybe I want to do a semester abroad or a year abroad. It's like, I might as well do the whole thing abroad, right? And funny enough, it's still cheaper than most US educations. Like London's maybe the one exception, because living in London is super, super expensive. But for the most part, the cost of tuition in the UK for international students doesn't really surpass 30,000, right? If you have a UK passport for whatever reason, it's like less than £10,000. So price can obviously factor in. And then, like we said, if you have an academic focus, it can make a lot of sense. And especially if you don't, you're not someone that has this crazy extracurricular profile and you didn't do all these other things, you don't really care about holistic admissions, again, you should really consider other parts of the world.
Great. Well, thank you, panelists. I'm gonna leverage you again here in a second for our questions, I know. But thank you all who've joined us as well. I guess I would just leave you with some little bit of parting advice. I think sometimes when we hear all of these admissions trends and, oh, I need to do depth of extracurriculars and my test scores need to be great. And I need to, there's going to be 150,000 applicants. So I need to have 1 million APs. We can sort of feel like we need to be on the treadmill. We need to make sure our kids are on the treadmill. And, the thing that I think all of us would agree, and we've been in this a very long time, the thing that is the most important, advantageous thing that you can do for your kid is make sure that your kid has balance and that their well-being is being prioritized, and that you are not doing things to get into college at the expense of your child's health, happiness, and sort of well-being. So, make sure that your kid is getting enough sleep, that they get downtime, that they have routines. Students are going to think better, perform better, be happier, and just be all over more compelling applicants if they are well-functioning humans. So with that, we're going to move to the questions. We will not get through all of them. I'm going to try and prioritize ones that I think most people will find helpful. But we will do our best to try and get back to you after the fact if we at all can. So if we have your information, we'll make sure that we do that. But the first question that we had is, how do you, and I don't know, Josh, Lisa, this might be good for one of you. How do you find the acceptance rate of out of state or by major? Like, how do you know what that is as opposed to just it's a 23% acceptance rate overall?
Lisa, I mean, obviously some schools do provide it. A phone call, nothing wrong with a phone call. People are, especially students, tend to be like scared of admissions officers because it's like, you're going to decide if I get in or not. You don't have to tell them your name. You can just call and just have like a list of questions ready. And it's just so much better than Google or ChatGPT. That being said, some schools are more forthcoming with their data. Others, the Stanfords and Harvards of the world, just for whatever reason, like to hold it back a little bit more. So again, it's partly going to be research, but also just get in touch directly.
Yeah, quite a few of the flagships have started doing it. So where it's most important is in those flagships, right? Because you get in-state, out-of-state. And quite a lot of them have started doing it, but I totally agree calling them. They're usually pretty more helpful than you think. So yeah.
Parents, please, this is an opportunity for your child to call.
Yes.
It is their process. They need to run it. Trust me, the admissions officers are noticing those things. Like, you don't do the research for them. Don't call on their behalf. They want to talk to your kid, not you. All right. We've got an interesting question here. Given the rising cost of education and the difficulty of the applications and then the tough job market afterwards, particularly some of the entry-level jobs, which AI is sort of the biggest threat to those jobs in some ways. Is there any data out there that shows, does it matter if a student graduates from a high-tiered university versus a lower-tiered university? Is it easier to land a high-paying job or, go on to higher education? What are we seeing from the data?
Depends on the research you look at, but a lot of like the Raj Chetty stuff. I mean, the prestige factor does factor in, like for the super elite schools. It does seem to play out. There's also a big piece, the differential like a return based on your major. And there's a lot of evidence, a lot of research in terms of over the past 10 years, in terms of certain majors, certain STEM fields, certain health fields, engineering, where they're making higher salaries, even like 10 years in, 20 years in. But there's a lot of questions of, will this data over the past 10 years hold in the next 10 years? And we've seen some real drop-offs with computer science. We've seen some early disruptions in the past couple of years. And the question, trying to find terra firma, solid, stable ground. And will prestige play the same role? Or is the safer bet going to the flagship, saving the resources and having money available later for grad school, other things? So it's really an open question right now. But looking back, the answer is yes. Looking forward, there's a real question. Will these trends continue?
And I will say also, just from my own experience and talking to, more recent grads and things, like at the end of the day, right, this is like one of my favorite questions, but at the end of the day, right, whatever you're looking for, it's kind of interested in three questions. One, which is, why are you applying for this? Whatever this is. Why do you want to do this? Is it grad school? Is it a job? Two, what have you done that you think prepares you for this opportunity? And then three, if you're granted this opportunity, what do you hope to do with it? What do you want to get out of this experience? And regardless in terms of the educational path to that, if your student can answer those three questions like thoughtfully and authentically, they're going to be in a fine place. And there's many different paths for students to get answers to those questions.
Thank you. All right, I want to see if we get through at least a few more here. These are some great questions. You guys have clearly put a lot of thought into them, and they're fantastic. I wish we could stay all night and answer all of them. So this one I hear a lot from people is, how do you think about the role of need-based financial aid and how that intersects with early decision and early action, right? So if you're needing to shop financial aid packages, but then that there's all of these advantages to applying early, kind of how do you hold those two things in tension and think about that?
Well, if you're applying early decision, some schools will do, can reach out to the financial aid office. Some of them will give you kind of an early estimate if you're thinking. They won't all do that, but there are some schools that will do that. So I've had decent luck with that with some schools. So I think that is one option, because you are making a commitment, right? And so there's also the calculators, some of them better than others, not always real accurate, but you can use those as well. Josh, what do you do for that?
Yeah, no, it's, you are technically, we say binding, and it's like, you're not going to go to jail if you don't end up at the school that you got into ED, especially the one kind of caveat is if the financial aid package doesn't work for you, they will release you from the ED. Right. And it's not like there's like a black mark on you because that was the context. Any other contexts, there will be a black mark, but if it's financial reasons, I still encourage to go for it. Obviously, you're kind of hoping for the financial piece. And of course, parents need to understand that when they fill out the FAFSA and the CSS, you have to be very accurate about everything. It's kind of beyond filling out your taxes, right? They want to know everything. And that way, if you're clear from the get-go, you're going to get a more kind of accurate financial aid picture. And you can always kind of go back too, right? If the package doesn't really work for you, and this is what I had to do when my parents were like, no, this is not enough. Go back and ask. And I was at the financial aid office my first 2 weeks of college, almost every day, being like, and then one guy actually told me maybe you shouldn't just be here. And then someone else is like, no. We're going to figure this out for you. And they found an extra 8,000, right? So you have to be willing to self-advocate. Obviously we hope it doesn't come to that. But yeah, you don't just kind of accept the first offer, but you also don't not ED because of financial aid.
Great. We're going to get through a couple more, but I did want to remind people or make sure that you're aware there's a poll that you should see. Oh, it's right there. There's a poll that you should see if you want more information about anything that you've heard tonight. If you're like, oh, I could really use help with that, or I just want to be on an email list to get more information about this, let us know. Just fill that poll out. Again, happy to follow up with you in any of the ways that you tell us that you want. So please take a minute and do that while we're answering these last few questions. That poll is going to remain up through the remainder of the Q&A. So I love this question. If my school doesn't offer AP classes, is AP testing still important? Like, is that going to be a black mark against me when I go to apply?
I'll take that one. So colleges, or every high school, they create something called a school profile, which lists the academic classes that are offered at that school. So if you go to what we call a non-AP school, and many high schools throughout the country are non-AP schools where they do not offer AP courses, that admission officer knows that, and they are absolutely not expecting an AP score from your student. So, transcripts, test score, like everything is read contextually. And what they mean by that, it's all within the context of your high school. What does your particular high school offer? So that's the lens that they're reading that transcript through. So if you are a student who is at a non-AP school, they are absolutely not expecting, AP scores in AP tests. And schools will vary. There are some non-AP schools that do offer AP tests, just, students want to take them. The students perform well on them, so they'll go ahead and offer them. Some non-AP schools are like, look, no, we're not going to lose instructional time. We're not going to offer them at our school, and you are in no way disadvantaged if that is a school that you attend.
Great. This next one is a little reading the tea leaves, but that is what this whole webinar is, right? Predictions. So I'm curious, we've got a question from someone saying, okay, the UCs are test blind now. Do you think they'll go back to test optional?
I think they will. That UC Davis report was pretty damning. That incredible increase in the number of kids who come in there with math. That's just.
I was say, Jed, for people who don't know, can you just get up for them?
Oh yeah, UC Davis. The number of kids who are remedial. They've been test blind now since like 2021, and all these kids are coming in with super grades, outstanding grades, getting A's in calculus. They're coming in, they can't do 8th grade math. They can't do algebra. And like the number has skyrocketed. And so the idea is that these test scores were balanced against all the grade inflation. And it was actually keeping people honest because people have incentives to give higher grades, helps their kids, better admissions outcomes. They go to the schools and they can't do math. And so that's the reason why having a standardized test score is useful, is important. And Worcester Poly, they came out and said test scores are worthless. We're never going to go back. 3 years later, test optional again. They were test blind, and they killed their experiment. I think UC's politics swing, things move, the administration, a little pressure from the White House. Ultimately, and just the general trend is going back. And so I feel like test blind is getting hard to defend, especially when you're admitting kids who can't do the work. And then that's just more resources, more kids failing out. It's more trouble for the university. And so I think within 5 years, they're back optional, probably sooner.
They were going to do their own tests.
Yeah.
Oh, I know. Man, the resources for that.
I'm just saying. Yeah.
I know.
All right.
We're
going to close out on another testing question because it's one I'm going to learn something here. What decisions are we seeing colleges make about the new optional science section on the ACT? Do we have enough decisions to make a recommendation to students about whether or not they should test?
So I think we're still waiting on data from it. I mean, our general recommendation is if you go down the ACT path to go ahead and take the ACT with science. To your example earlier in your intro, Natalie, I'd rather have students have a science score and maybe ultimately not need it than not have a science score and then apply, for instance, to a Boston University. So Boston University is test optional, but if you submit an ACT score, they will only look at it if you've taken it with the science. So I don't want students suddenly adding a BU to their list. And now, back to your example, they're scrambling to take the ACT with that science. So I think everyone's kind of been in wait and see. We saw this evolution a little bit with the writing, that over time schools became very comfortable with not needing that writing score. We'll see if that ends up happening with the science, but I don't think we're there yet. So as a hedge, if your student takes the ACT, our recommendation is go ahead and take it with the science, but we'll see how this kind of plays out. It's certainly a trend we'll follow over the next couple of years. but that's kind of where we are right now.
And
Jed, anything to add to that?
One time with science.
Yes.
Right.
A third of our kids aren't taking it with science at all, but I think just having that one in case to be you.
Yes.
Yeah, just to
So
have
not
that
every
score
time, just
if
one.
you need it. Right.
Great. All right. Well, with that, Josh, Drew, Lisa, Jed, thank you all for your wisdom and your expertise. This has been just a fabulous hour. I hope those of you who are still with us have gotten a lot out of it. Like I said, I wish we could stay on and answer another 40 questions, but just really appreciate you all and look forward to next year's predictions.
That's good. All right, good night.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.